Hi everyone, thanks for stopping by and for returning to the old world. Today, a big question looking at the aesthetic of the Empire for Warhammer the Old World if and when it gets released. And not only that, looking at would this have an impact on the models that we're going to be using on the tabletop. Now, I did find this a much bigger question than I thought it would be. Once I started delving into my thoughts, I thought I'd be able to reach some conclusions fairly easily, and actually there's probably more factors to take into account than I'd appreciated, and I've probably missed a few of them as I've gone through this. In order to establish what the Empire aesthetic could be, should be, in my opinion, I think there's a certain number of questions we need to ask. One, what is the Empire? What are its influences? Secondly, what are the characteristics of the people or the creatures that live in this state? We need to consider the setting of Warhammer the Old World itself and how this influences the overall aesthetic position. We need to think about the wider lore, both from an aesthetic perspective, but also how that will impact the makeup of our armies. And once we've done all of that, we can come to a view around what should the aesthetic look like. Can it be? Is it the same? Is it not the same? I know Games Workshop have said that our existing models will be usable in Warhammer, so that's fine. That kind of is the answer, that the models can be the models. But is there scope for change? And actually, should there be some degree of change? Let's give it a thought. So, what is the Empire? Don't think it's particularly controversial to say that the Empire is influenced historically by the Holy Roman Empire. The controversial bit is probably slapping a date on it, but looking at the developments of the arts that are around, the designs for the steam tank, for example, name characters such as Luther Hess, who is clearly strongly linked to, Martin Luther, who was around in the early 1500s and when he rose to prominence. The end times being a few years after that, I think we're probably looking at around the mid-1500s, deep into the Renaissance period. I think the style of the models, you can see a bunch of Imperial models before you, all by Games Workshop, and by different generations. Some of the old metals, a couple of an old plastic, and then a couple more recent models which are still available, I believe, from the Games Workshop web store as part of their Age of Sigmar offering. They strike me as something appropriate to the mid-1500s. Could well be wrong. The other thing to note, of course, is that although there are many races living in the Empire, it's predominantly a human state. That takes us on to our second question. What are the characteristics of the creatures that live in the Empire? It's a human state, and humans are relatively short-lived, but also capable of being very ambitious. We know that they can be ambitious. We'll just look at our current times and see what people are up to in order to get themselves into the history books, and the rate of change that is possible, the level of technological advancement. We can compare this to some of the older races in the Warhammer setting. The dwarves, for example, very conservative, but much longer lived than a human, where a human might live for 30, 40 years tops. In a Renaissance society, a dwarf will live for several hundred years. This means that for a human to achieve something of note, they need to get on with it and do it quickly, whereas a dwarf would have time to design, test, tweak, test, tweak, test over and over again in order to come out with a product that works really, really well. You also add in, of course, the dwarven conservatism and the risk that if they come out with some new invention that doesn't work, there's a good chance it shave your head and get eaten by a troll time. So that may well have an impact on the individual ambition and the rate of change possible for dwarven society. Looking at our own world setting, so Earth, the real world, we can see that humans are capable, even when technology doesn't necessarily move quickly, and we have seen rapid development of technology at certain times in our history. Fashions change quite regularly as well. If you look at the kind of things our grandparents wore when they were young, our parents, what we wore, and then what the youth of today wear, there's the generational change in the styles of clothing that people wear. And even if we look back and say, well, rate of change is a bit slower, we're still, with the old world, talking about a time frame a lot earlier than the end times. That neatly segues into, well, when is the old world set? And I think I've been quite blasé in my thoughts on this previously around, well, when did it happen? I think this is something that we're all guilty of. Well, a lot of people are guilty of when talking about history. We'll talk about the 1960s, a 10-year period. Then we'll talk about the interwar period, 1918 to 39, which is a 21-year period. We'll talk about the Victorian era, which is 70-odd years. We'll talk about the Stuarts, which is multi-generational. Talk about the Roman Empire, which was around for hundreds of years. And we'll do that without taking into account the vast change between time Rome rose as a power and when it was retreating from the far extents of its empire. So we need to think carefully, I think, around the dates involved. The end times occurred in the imperial year 2528. We go back to the Chaos Incursion, Magnus the Pious, all that sort of good stuff. We're looking at 2302 to 04. It's about 200 years. We look at the catastrophic events represented by Games Workshop spin-off game Mordheim. That happened in 1999, so around 500 years before the end times. And we need to go even further back to the start of the time of the Three Emperors, which is when Warhammer the Old World is probably going to be set. And that is a date of 1547. Now, 1,000 years is an awful long time for there to be minimal to no change. Particularly as we do know that humans don't sit around that long without some kind of technological change, without changing the style of clothes, etc. 1,000 years, for our context here in 2022, would take us to an Anglo-Saxon state in the UK. Very, very different from the modern world. And if we knock 1,000 years off our date of 1550-ish for the Empire, that takes us to 500 CE. Again, we're looking at a state of dress, a state of war, very, very different. But we can't just look at strict dates and move everything back 1,000 years, because we have to make sure that the established law isn't interfered with on too grand a scale. And this will not only have an impact on the look of the individual models, but also on the armies that we collect as a whole. I say this, for example, when we talk about magic, it was Magnus the Pious that established the colleges of magic. Before then, wizardry, witchcraft was firmly looked down upon, and the only wizards you have running around are going to be hedge wizards and sorcerers. People who are potentially as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy because they haven't been trained in how to use their powers safely and perhaps don't even know the full extent of their powers and what they can and cannot do. While some of these wizards may appear in a lord's army because that individual lord has taken the risk of having an illegal magic user in their retinue, in their household, having a level 4 wizard commanding an army full of state troops isn't really going to be realistic, given the views on wizards at the time and the fact that they might have an equivalent of state troops, maybe if it's a powerful sorcerer with their own kind of thing going on, but it just seems that how wizards fit into the army is going to be a bit different. Development of artillery. I don't know precisely when the College of Engineers is formed, but if, I say if, because I don't know the exact dates for this point, but if it's the art of gunnery hasn't come to the Empire by 1547, then the great cannon that we're used to seeing, mortars, etc., they're not going to be a thing. And even if they are a thing, they're probably going to be in a much cruder state and less likely to be mainstream battlefield weapons. So we might need to look at more traditional weapons for our war machines. We also need to look at some of the other factions when determining what the Empire should look like, because we can't have the Empire losing really what makes it the Empire, but also not infringing on the unique selling points of other factions. So Bretonnia is a really good point on this, and we know that from its formation, Bretonnia has always been this knightly, valorous, chivalric, feudal state. At the time of the Empire, of the end times, the Bretonians are pretty much, I think, a high medieval society. Knock 1,000 years off that, and they become part of the Roman Empire, pretty much. Way before knights, way before chivalry, feudalism. A very, very different thing. And they've always had this link in the Warhammer setting to the Arthurian type legends, knights, quests, all this sort of stuff. And that needs to stay. So we can only push Bretonnia back so far to make it a usable state and to retain what makes it Bretonnia. Now we know that Bretonnia, probably a couple of hundred years as a society, is earlier than the Empire, high medieval against the mid-Renaissance. So we need to factor that in to what we see around our state. And we know as well, Mordheim, and for the releases for models for that game, which happened in 1999, in our time and the Imperial calendar, so 500 years before the end times, the human factions went on, I think, to form the basis of the models used for the Empire Militia box set, which was still usable for the end time. So we're talking negligible change in 500 years in fashion. Now, I don't think we can have another 500 years of no change, but it does mean the rate of change is much slower in the Warhammer setting than we would expect if we were directly applying the lessons from our own history. So where does that lead us? Well, the Empire can't step on the toes of the Bretonnians. The Bretonnians need to remain chivalric state. But if we move the empire back to a pre-Renaissance society, which I think we probably need to do, then it becomes the same. So what happens? Well, I would suggest Bretonnia stays medieval, becomes an early medieval society. More Norman. It keeps the knights, it keeps the chivalric culture, it keeps its link to medieval France. Just at the early stage. The empire could be a state just starting to creep into the Renaissance, 1400s-ish. So instead of 1,000 years, we're kind of knocking 100 years or so, 150 years back off the timeline. Just starting to grasp the art, starting to develop more modern weaponry. Guns starting to be used as a battlefield weapon as opposed to just something used for sieges. And I think we can also just fit into this point that at one point in the history of the Warhammer Fantasy game, Bretonnians did actually have access to gunpowder weapons, just of the early and more medieval variety. Not as powerful as the Great Cannon of the Empire, if memory serves. I could be wrong on that, but I do know that they had access to gunpowder weapons. So overall, I think this means we can avoid homogenizing the humans. They can stay distinct, but also take into account the vast periods of time that pass between the time of the three emperors and the end times and the models we already exist. Now, I said at the start of the video, Games Workshop has said our existing models can be used, and that's fantastic. Particularly those of us who might have quite large collections of Empire figures and figures that are usable in an Empire army from third-party manufacturers or 3D prints or whatever. But I do think that there does need to be an element of change reflected in what the Empire looks like. And unfortunately, that would have, from my view, an impact on the kind of models that might be appropriate if I was starting a new army for an imperial force. But ultimately, it's up to the individual, I think. Do you use the Games Workshop official models? Do you want to go down a different route? And as long as you're not at a Games Workshop event or in a Warhammer store, as long as your opponent doesn't have any issues with what you're using, then really go nuts, do what you want. As long as you can use the models effectively and everyone knows what they are under the rule set, then great. But for me, I think an Empire army should probably look a little bit different. I'd like to just thank you for listening to me ramble on for the last 18 and a half minutes or so on this topic. If you've got any thoughts around what the Empire should look like, that would be quite interesting to hear about. Other than that, thank you very much once again for dropping by. This is Return to the Old World. Have a great day.